Estou passando nesse podcast para dividir uma informação que fez toda a diferença na minha vida. Quer fazer pós-graduação, mas tá impossível correr de um lugar para o outro?
Pois é, ainda mais com o trânsito.
Então você precisa conhecer a educação à distância do Senac. Sabia que é nota máxima no MEC? E tem diversos cursos de pós-graduação para te levar ainda mais longe. 100% online, sem necessidade de TCC e com acesso direto a todos os professores.
Ah, saber isso fez diferença sim.
Inscreva-se já na pós-graduação EAD. Quer saber? Senac EAD.
Who knows what tomorrow will bring? Who knows if the songbirds will sing? You might have all...
Welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Alexandro. Predictions, forecasts, outlooks, projections, and those who make a living out of them have taken a battering recently. In part, this is down to increased volatility. In part, it is down to a misunderstanding of the nature and purpose of forecasts. In largest part, I think, it is down to a world that is so polarized and tribal, each of us takes helpful "this may happens" and turns them into "this will happens." So what's the point? Why try to predict anything when it is both increasingly impossible and a magnet for opprobrium? Well, because in the words of Alfred Toffler, possibly the most famous modern futurologist, you've got to think about big things while you're doing small things, so that all the small things go in the right direction. I spoke to eminent scenario planner, best-selling author and futurologist Richard Watson about, well, everything. Quiet Riot. Hello, Richard. Welcome to Quiet Riot.
Thank you, Alex. Nice to see you.
Now, shall we start with just some basic housekeeping, I guess? What is the difference between futurism and futurology?
Well, I'm actually kind of glad you asked that because I actually don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. And I get slightly cross about misuse of words. I mean, the correct term to my mind is futurology, to distinguish itself from futurism, which was the sort of the art movement in the early 1900s that came out of Italy and then Russia to some extent. And I guess what's going on is people are just, doing what they do the whole time. They're just shortening things. They're being a little bit lazy. It's a convenience to call it futurism, futurists, etc. However, it's kind of interesting to me because there is a little bit of, they're completely unconnected in the sense, but there is some crossover. I mean, the main crossover is the futurists in the early 1900s worship technology. Now, I think most, and this would be true going back a few decades as well, have focused very much on technology. They're fairly positive about technology. So there's a sort of classic sort of convergence there. I mean, where it starts to differ is the original, well, actually, maybe not. The original futurists worship speed as well. And I guess actually, if you think about Silicon Valley, yes, they do worship speed, actually. They worship digital speed, online speed, but also speed, I need toothpaste in 5 minutes delivered to my house. And also maybe a little bit of more of a focus than other people on
and the philosophy of move fast and break things, that's entirely a Silicon Valley thing.
Yeah, that's very much, and it was quite destructive, and the early futurists were very into destruction. I mean, they were into violence. They were very, very pro-war. I mean, they loved blowing things up and all that kind of stuff. So there is some interesting crossover there. There'd be an interesting paper to be written one of these days about the two things.
I am delighted then to be speaking to a futurologist rather than a sort of radical
I don't mind
vibe.
Anything. I don't care. The F word. It's all the same F word, right?
What do you think is a basic test to tell the serious exponents of the discipline from the cranks? Because anyone can write a book and call themselves a futurologist and say that I think these are the trends.
Yeah, I mean, you basically just call yourself one. I mean, there are academic courses. They're few and far between, but they exist, particularly in the US. I think it's out of Houston in Texas, in Australia, out of Melbourne. They tend to call themselves sort of future studies. The latest buzzword, by the way, is anticipatory studies, which makes me smile quite a bit. I mean, it's very subjective, isn't it? Loads and loads of people. I mean, there's been a real trend for people calling themselves futurists. I mean, to some extent, you just call yourself a futurist and you make lots of pronouncements that usually sort of start with, it's the end of, it's the death of, or this will take over, whatever. Very, very sort of singular predictions. I think the more serious ones, they write books that are properly published, not self-published. I've done both. They would write papers and get cited. The ones I really take notice of put their necks on the line. I like people that attach a date to something. So if you're going to say that cash is going to die out, I mean, that's a very easy thing to say, and it may or may not be true. Well, I mean, if you go out far enough, it's probably true, but attach a date to it, by when, and then have an argument as well. But I think dates are really good. Or the other thing I quite like is attaching probability. I've done some work with the military over the years, and some of the intelligence people, I don't know if they still do it, but they used to attach probabilities to certain words to make you careful with language. So if you said something will, that's at least 90% probability. I'm quite fond of that. I think I actually stole that idea and used it in a book once. So that's a good thing to do. But beyond that, it's difficult to really separate. I mean, you obviously get specialists. There are medical futurists out there. There are tourism futurists. I think that's good on one level because it's a specialization and you know more about something. But I think that's tricky because you've got to overlay all these other factors. I mean, it's all very well looking at tourism, but you've got to look at climate and resources and politics and economics and demographics. You can't just look at one area because everything is influencing everything else.
I come from a slightly different background of law economics policy. And what you're describing to me sounds like, I guess, macro risk planning. Is that
part of it? I mean, I've done quite a lot of work in risk, particularly extreme risks. But it's also, you can flip it. I mean, it's also lovely roadmaps for innovation and product development, corporate strategy. If you took out the word prediction and used the word forecasting instead, then it sort of has a sort of air of respectability.
Yes.
Although actually, when you start thinking about it, the forecasting sort of profession, if you want to call it that, or professions, are probably no better than futurologists. I mean, look at economic forecasters.
They will tell you that they predict a range of outcomes. And I suspect you do much the same in your work. Can you give me like a good example of a policy prediction or a commercial application that basically was predicted and came true, and the people who had access to that prediction managed to get an advantage from it? I'm trying to think of its practical implication.
I've said plenty of things that have proven absolutely spot on. I mean, ranging from the recent pandemic through to the overuse of mobile phones, through to the non-death of physical books. The one that actually, funnily enough, springs to mind in terms of somebody doing something with something is I was talking to many years ago, talking to IKEA, and for some reason got really onto the idea of sleep and sleep trends and people not sleeping well and how this was going to become an increasing problem. And I don't think they were even selling beds when I first mentioned this. There may be other reasons they suddenly started getting quite heavily into bedding and sleep. But I remember that one quite vividly. I mean, most of the things I can remember are people not taking any notice. I mean, I remember sitting in a workshop with the military defense ones who were quite rightly completely obsessed and focused on China and just sort of scrawling on a giant whiteboard Russia to try and get somebody to actually sort of take some notice. Although the very best example of not being listened to, and there's, by the way, slight sidebar here, there's a fascinating discussion to be had about who gets listened to, when and why. And timing seems to be very important. You could be far too early. Generally, it's sort of older white men with certain sort of backgrounds. I mean, George Soros did say something about smart mobiles quite late in the game, actually, and people started listening, when other people, including a lot of quite serious academics, were being sort of dismissed. But the one that really is in my head at the moment is the pandemic, because I was in some cabinet office workshops in 2015 on extreme risks. And the way I remember it is that the consensus in the room was that a pandemic was the most probable high impact risk that anyone could think of. And I think this then got modeled in a thing called Project Cigna. But then at the end of the day, we were still wholly unprepared. So, there's a sort of Cassandra element to this. You can be absolutely bang on right and nobody will take the blind bit of notice to you. And it's very difficult actually to convince people to do things as a result of anything you say, because, there's no data. We're talking about the future here, potentially the quite distant future. There is no data attached to that. The best you're going to do is extrapolate historical data. So that makes it quite tricky. It comes down to sort of persuasive powers more than anything else, I think. I'm not trying to be right about things. I mean, I'm trying to help people be less wrong, if you were. And I'm also fundamentally, what I'm really trying to do is just get people to think. And my experience is that most people are just running around, putting out fires, dealing with very short-term issues, quarterly results, annual results, 4 or 5 year election cycles. There are very, very few people thinking a generation ahead or a few decades ahead. And I'm just trying to say, actually, it's useful to do that. Although quite a lot of the time, the future is a bit of an excuse, because actually what they end up doing is thinking very deeply about what they're doing right now. So it's sort of subterfuge to some extent, but it's subterfuge that's very effective sometimes.
So, what I'm visualizing while you're describing that is a number of lines extending to the future that each have a current trajectory, I guess, and affect each other. So, the fewer lines you're looking at and the closer to now you're looking at, the more likely you are to predict what the trajectory will be in 5 or 10 years. But when you're looking at 20 different lines interacting, let's say climate change and geopolitics and technology advancing and all of those things, and you're looking at 50 years in the future, then we're really in educated guess territory, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. Maybe, yeah, educated, informed guesses. I mean, I like 5 to 15 years, because if you go under 5 and arguably even under 10, the present has this kind of gravitational pull, and you end up just talking about next Tuesday if you're not careful. If you go more than 15, 20, it gets very silly. I mean, it gets into some sort of sci-fi type stuff. And the number of workshops I've been in where you're trying to get people to go further out, and they just end up talking about UFOs and aliens the whole time. So there is a bit of a sweet spot, and also it's got to be sort of practical and useful. So I think 10 years is generally good to try and stretch people's imaginations a bit.
Because I suspect then a company or a government will not pay any attention to what you're saying anyway if you're talking about 30 years' time, because they will think, well, we don't.
I mean, there are exceptions. I mean, if you think about climate change, was quite interesting, and to some extent, it sort of followed the sort of the classic cycle. It was completely ridiculed and ignored for a very long time, and then it gets taken seriously. And we are looking at, climate change. We're generally talking a couple of decades out, middle of the century is what we're thinking about and what we're reacting to now. The other one that's like that we take almost no notice of, to my mind, is societal aging, which is one of the biggest trends around. It's more or less global, with some exceptions like sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and so on. And we're just not responding. We still have organizations and businesses, governments obsessed with youth, the 16 to 24s or something, which is what it has been historically, but they're not where the action is anymore. They're not the ones with the time or the money. There's not even that many of them anymore, but we're still focused on them. And if you look at what's been going on with digital transformation, that completely ignores people aged about 70 plus. Again, with the recent pandemic, it's all very well having that track and trace, but that kind of assumed you had a smartphone. So there's a sort of implicit issue around that I don't think is being taken seriously enough.
Tem um momento na carreira que precisamos dar um passo além. É hora de fazer uma pós-graduação. Só que muitas vezes o custo pesa no bolso, inviabilizando tudo. Com a pós-graduação do Senac, você não tem esse problema. Cursos com até 50% de desconto e muito mais tempo para pagar. TCC opcional, modelo flexível com aulas presenciais e online e alguns cursos com apenas 12 meses de duração. Não tem mais desculpa, hein? Saiba mais em sp.senac.br/pós-graduação.
Richard, I've come across a term in some of your work that I find quite attractive, and that's preferred futures. And the reason I find that attractive is because it sort of recalls in my head what Karl Popper said, that the future is still happening. The future is open. We're shaping it right now. And often if you're looking at predictions and forecasts, you're predicting things that will happen almost inevitably. But this idea of preferred futures, can you explain that to me? Because it sounds more active, it sounds more dynamic.
It's been around for a while as part of sort of scenario planning, practice, theory, discussions, a sort of 3P model. So you look at driving forces of the present, you look at probable futures, and then you look at possible futures, which are essentially highly unlikely, but they're not impossible. And we started playing around with a sort of a fourth P, which was preferable. I had a really interesting chat once with a guy called Theodore Zeldin, who I got to know quite well at Oxford, who's a sort of social historian. And he said, Richard, why are you so focused or so obsessed with worrying about what's going to happen? Why don't you spend more time thinking about what you'd like to happen? And I think that's preferred futures to me. So yes, you can't completely ignore change on so many levels. You've got to be sort of slightly prepared for things. But that is quite negative, reactive, and a lot of the time you're just wasting your time. The thing about preferred futures is, well, what do we want the world to be like? And let's try and create that future. And it links quite strongly into sort of vision in terms of organizations and where they'd like to be in 30 years. And then you sort of backfill with a sort of narrative that's very compelling and drives people forward. The other thing is, I wouldn't call it utopian, but it's very, very positive. I mean, I'm aware of a friend of one of my sons who has set an essay at university to discuss whether the future was open or closed. And I'd not come across these terms before, but it's pretty obvious what it means. Closed future is there is only one. It's inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it, which is an appalling idea. An open future is obviously one where there's lots of possibilities and maybe you can influence them. And apparently the entire class decided to write essays about closed futures, which I found quite depressing. I think the future's always been open, and we should spend more time, particularly in the light of AI. I mean, if we do get into sort of general or strong AI, and God forbid we get into conscious machines, I think that's going to throw quite a strong spotlight on what we as a species are actually good at and for. So having a sort of vision, preferred future for the human race is something I think we should start thinking about. And that would actually have to go out decades and generations for that to work properly.
In 2021, you said that change had sped up to such an extent that it was making trend prediction incredibly difficult. And arguably, things have sped up even more since 2021. Even in the last month, we saw Assad fall in Syria in the space of 4 days, which genuinely none of the security experts in the area expected. We saw South Korea, the president there attempt a coup out of nowhere. So how do you cope with that in your line of business, I guess? Do you cope with it by broadening the possible scenarios? Do you cope with it by looking only at shorter time frames?
I can't remember if it was William Gibson or somebody, but they said, I mean, 10 years ago, they'd given up writing science fiction because the present was quite weird enough, which echoes a conversation I was having. A good friend of mine, I've just written a children's book with, Levi Tidar, and we were having a chat about, what is the future from a sort of practical definition of being a writer. And I remember vividly his response is, oh, well, it's when things start to get weird. Well, it's hard to imagine a present that's much weirder than the one we've got. I don't think necessarily your examples are examples of acceleration. They're, to my mind, they're more examples of unexpected events. And, you could point to the pandemic, Brexit, Trump as those sort of things. I mean, the acceleration thing's a tricky one. Certain things are definitely accelerating, but I think people overplay it, particularly futurists. Computing and AI, there are a series of exponentials around that. And there are a series of genuine exponentials around genetics. But beyond that, I'm not entirely convinced that everything's speeding up. I mean, it's more connected and we're getting to hear about things faster than we used to. But I think if you were living in between 1900 and 1950, there was more innovations, fundamental innovation going on than between 1950 and 2000. And the point was that we've just tweaked stuff that already existed. I mean, we haven't just invented the motor car. We've just decided that you might have a self-driving one. We've not invented aircraft or anything like that. Between 1950 and 2000, it was the social change that was quite significant. So certain things are, I think, definitely speeding up, but it is exaggerated. And the other thing that almost no futurists will talk about is the fact there's a lot of stuff that's not changing at all. I mean, all the focus is on, new stuff, new revolutions, new technologies, what have you. But there's a tremendous amount that hasn't changed at all. Now, in terms of how you cope with a mixture of some acceleration for sure and phenomenal amount of quite improbable events, that's tricky. I mean, scenarios themselves, I think, are far less useful than they used to be because they take quite a long time to create properly and they're supposed to last for quite a long time. And they're just not suitable for that. I mean, you'd have to be doing scenarios every quarter practically. And I think for that reason, a lot of people have stopped doing them, and to some extent quite rightly. I mean, even corporate strategy is getting a little bit lame in the light of the level of change and unexpected events. Beyond that, I mean, how do you cope with it? Probably sort of more thinking. You just got to think more deeply. The thing that's problematic at the moment for a lot of people running organizations is it's not so much the speed of things, the volatility or the unexpected events. It's just the sheer amount of information.
Mm.
And it's very difficult to know, well, what should I pay attention to? Because I can't pay attention to everything. I've got to pick. So what do I pick? And that's a tricky one. I don't think there's a very simple answer to that. But I think scenarios at the moment are a little bit out of fashion because things are moving too fast, because things are a bit too weird. But I think a lot of these things go through cycles.
So maybe this isn't acceleration, it's rather a cycle of volatility that we're seeing.
Possibly. I mean, that's an interesting conversation or a paper to write, to be honest. I'm not sure. I'm trying to keep an open mind about that.
Now, having given all those caveats, can you name, let's say, one trend in the medium term that you feel is quite a central scenario that we will see manifest that maybe people are not so aware of?
Well, again, to repeat myself, I mean, demographics is destiny, as they used to say. The most predictable, if you like, the one that has the highest level of probability is, I would say, is societal aging. And take that alongside declining fertility. So, I don't agree with Musk on many things, but he's right about the fact that we might be running out of humans quite soon. Not everywhere. I mean, if you want to see this at its height, go to Japan, but Europe and even the UK is aging pretty rapidly. As I said earlier, the exception is probably sub-Saharan Africa, a bit of Middle East and Asia. In China, I mean, there is a phenomenal statistic floating around, which may or may not be true, which is that by 2050, China will be half the size that it is now. And to some extent, they're in a bit of a race to get rich before they get old. They're putting in all the sort of the infrastructure they need and salting away a bit of money and what have you. But I think societal aging is the one organizations should probably pay attention to almost more than anything else because of the level of certainty. And there's tremendous opportunity around there. The other one that's sort of connected just demographics generally, is the war for talent, because you potentially got shrinking workforces. You're potentially moving into a more of a sort of protectionist era, more of a localization rather than globalization. So the fight to attract and retain talent is going to intensify, and that would be a big focus. And it's a lot easier to deal with than trying to predict where quantum or AI is going to go, I think. So I do like demographics. I know you only asked for one, but I'll give you some others.
But can I ask something on the demographics? If we are talking about, let's say, increased use of AI, robotics, virtual work environments, is actually having fewer people a problem?
Well, it's having fewer people is not a problem from a sustainability resources point of view. The less people, the better to some extent. And there are people preaching that gospel to some extent. I mean, you mentioned AI. I mean, I think the main reason we are rolling out AI, robotics, extreme automation is because of declining populations. I mean, again, you look at Japan, which is aging faster than any other country on earth, as far as I'm aware. They need really advanced robotics to care for older people and younger people because they just haven't got enough people sort of in the middle that can deal with things. Again, they all sort of link together to some extent, but that's very much the one I would focus on. I think older populations are probably more conservative. They are less innovative. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but it's a goodie. And my reading of that is one of the key factors around scientific innovation, but I think innovation generally, is you need young people. It's generally people under the age of about 25, 30. So if you've got a planet full of really old people, theoretically, you'll get less innovation. I think people will probably be more risk averse. And you've obviously got more money being spent on healthcare, which is a good and a bad thing altogether. You've got more pressure on pension systems. The good news is you'll probably be less likely to go to war unless you automate war, because, to do conventional warfare, you need young people. Although that seems to be shifting now. It's all being automated.
Well, it is and it isn't, because the war we're observing in Ukraine is a very bizarre mix of very new technology and very, very old techniques, not even Second World War, sort of First War techniques, especially on the Russian side. They are just throwing meat at it.
It's First World War, it's trench. So there's all kinds of consequences that you could unpick. You remind me of something I think is quite important about the future, which is people think of the future in kind of binary terms, that something will happen which will kill something that's been around for a while. But I think the future is and, not or. So yes, look at Ukraine. You've got the First World War going on one level, but then you've got, satellites and drones and, so you've got both, which is, so I think and, not or.
And exploding e-scooters. What's an example of something that's slightly a more outside bet, but still a possible scenario?
Are you talking about things that are less likely, things that are further out?
I'm talking about, I guess, your favorite pet theory. that is an outside
Oh,
pet.
my favorite crazy one is, we're going through this digital transformation, digital revolution. I'm a big fan of trends and counter trends and pushbacks and action reaction. I'm waiting for the analog transformation or the analog revolution. I think it strikes me that it's not that it sort of goes around in circles, but it's a bit like a pendulum, and we often push it too far, and then it sort of swings back. So I'm sort of quite fond of this idea that we're going to get rid of some digital and be more disconnected in the future and embrace some old ideas, be they vinyl records, writing with fountain pens, seeing people in person, meeting people in a pub rather than on a dating app. I quite like that one. It's a bit of a cheeky one, but I quite like that.
I think that's entirely possible, to be honest.
Again, it's almost Newtonian in the sense that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. I wouldn't say equal and opposite, but if you've got a big enough trend like globalization, it will spawn something in the opposite direction, which is localization. Or just a silly example: fast food, slow food. And there is risk inherent in that, but there's also phenomenal opportunity. I mean, I personally think globalization is kind of, I wouldn't call it ending at the moment, but I think physical globalization is being severely restrained. I mean, I think virtual globalization or digital globalization may continue, but the rise of the local, the sort of, on the one hand, that's a sort of nasty xenophobic protectionism, but on the other hand, it's a rather lovely, neighborly, sustainable, human side to things. And I think you can apply that to almost anything. I mean, if a trend is big enough, it will spawn something in the opposite direction, although it's very, very rare it's as strong as the original force, and it's very, very rare, I think, for the reaction to get rid of the cause. I mean, again, it'll be they'll sit rather uncomfortably together to some extent. So you might have streamed music, but people also want to go to concerts in person. Again, that seems like a contradiction, but it's not at all.
And I think the demographic trends that you were describing are particularly important in this, because it's usually young people who kind of push back against something that's a very established thing. And on that, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned it, you recently joined forces with a science fiction writer to write a children's book. And to me, that feels quite significant. It feels like quite a meaningful thing for you to do. I'm just not sure about the meaning. Is it you basically giving up on our generation?
There was an element of that. I mean, I'm better now to some extent, but a year or two ago, I could barely think about the future. It reached its zenith when we had Trump and a pandemic going on at the same time. I just couldn't deal with anything after that. And to some extent, I have just got a bit sort of depressed about where the whole world's going and various possibilities and scenarios. It was all just getting too negative and dystopian. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice? I mean, I've always wanted to write a kid's book about the future. I've had that idea for about a decade. I was thinking particularly about the kids that really suffered through the pandemic. You've got climate change is worrying a lot of them. There's the social media, which I cannot believe how stressful that would be if you were in your early teens or something. I just thought, they're surrounded by all this negativity. And I'm reminded, actually, I was on a bus once going through Westminster, and there was a sort of schools march or something, and it was to do with climate change fundamentally, I think. And there was one placard that said, it said something like, why bother going to school if there is no future? And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to do something about that. So I thought, well, what about writing a book? First of all, it's about the distant future. I mean, it starts off, a few decades into the future, but it goes thousands of years, hundreds and then thousands of years in the future. What if we did an incredibly optimistic book for children about the future? So I'm thinking the sort of the vibe of the early Star Treks or something. So there is no negativity in it. There's no war. There's no disease. There's nothing nasty in this book. It's just sort of universal optimism. In fact, the brief I came up with for the illustrator was California in the 1970s. This sense of the sun is out, the sky is blue, and anything is possible. We just wanted to try and convey that. It's targeted to sort of 8 to 10-year-olds fundamentally, but it may travel a bit further than that. So to answer the question, yes, I needed something for my own head to be optimistic and again, preferred futures. I did have the sort of slightly naughty thought recently that, maybe if it does really well, you could do a sequel, but wouldn't it be fun to just totally reverse it? And to do, I don't know if you know those books, Horrible Histories. We could do Horrible Futures, where everything currently exists goes horribly, horribly wrong. So what's the dark side of AI, robotics, climate change, obesity? I mean, it's a long list, right? That could be quite funny, and it wouldn't be, tongue seriously in the side of your cheek. I mean, it could be this sort of lovely sort of black humor, which maybe would work, maybe it wouldn't.
I can really see that as as a Netflix series or something as well. I think that's got
Well, funnily enough,
legs.
I mean, so I wrote this with Levi Tidar. I should plug this, shouldn't I? It's called The Children's Book of the Future with Levi Tidar. He's a proper
We'll
science
drop a
fiction
link
writer.
in the show notes
Yeah,
as
that'd be
well.
great. But it has dawned on us that there is television potential here, without a shadow of a doubt, on various levels.
Absolutely. My last question is a slightly more self-involved one, because I know you're a Hellenophile and you spend part of your time in Idra or Hydra, the anglicized version. And I wondered, oracles, soothsayers in Greek mythology, they don't do too well. They're usually cursed in some way. They're usually excluded from society in some way. It's almost as if being able to see the future with more clarity than others is actually a huge burden. Do you feel that sometimes?
Funnily enough, in Greece, we have got a place very high up on the hill. So it's almost sort of the hermit thing going on. I think locally we're known as the fools on the hill. And there's nothing like a decent view to stimulate the mind, actually. So it's the perfect place to just sit and look out. Greece to me is all about the light and the gods and deep history. And it's potentially quite a good place to go and let the mind settle a bit and be less distracted. And there's some tremendous simplicity there, which I quite like. So we'll see how it goes. But I mean, historically speaking, there's amusing things to be said about me up a hill in Greece. That's for sure.
Listen, I'm delighted to hear you say that, because whenever people ask me, do you miss the heat? Do you miss the sea? Do you miss the food? My answer is always, I miss the light. There is something very special about the light in the Aegean specifically that I have not seen replicated anywhere else in the world. And so next time I'm on my home island of Mykonos, I shall think of you across the Aegean, looking in the opposite direction.
You should come and visit. You should come and visit. I mean, the other thing I love about Greece is I would like to think it's the future of humanity over there. That they do understand the importance of conversation, not being glued to phones, the importance of family, a lot of the things that we've sort of lost. There's the dog. Again, if I'm slightly despairing of where things are going, and actually one thing I didn't mention was one of the things that comes off partly aging, but if you overlay certain types of technology and social media, I think the biggest problem we're probably going to have this century is loneliness. But that's not a global problem. I don't think that's a problem you'd have in Greece or southern Italy or southern Spain. That's highly unlikely to be an issue. But I think in countries like the UK or US that have empowered individualism, that could be a problem. So I'm hoping places like Greece are going to teach large parts of the rest of the world actually how to live. And actually, a few people have said, "What on earth do you do over there?" And I just said, "Well, I live."
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a delight to chat to you. I wish we could have you on every week.
Thank you very much.
What a difference a day made, 24 little hours.
I recorded this interview with Richard Watson just before Christmas, and it has really stayed with me. It's percolated. There is a lot in it that could make one severely glum, but there is an overarching theme that I have found exceptionally inspirational. There is so much wrong around us right now that the magnitude of change needed feels vast, unmanageable, paralyzing. But what if we did not focus exclusively on all the things that need to change and change right now? What if we think of profound change as a destination, let's say 20 years away? In a journey of that length, managing to nudge our current trajectory even a fraction of a degree off its current horrible course can have a dramatic effect. And that sort of adjustment feels completely within reach. So I leave you with the words of Lutheran priest and anti-Nazi dissident Dietrich Bonhoeffer, murdered by the regime days before Germany surrendered, which makes, I think, these words doubly touching. The essence of optimism is that it takes no account of the present. If you enjoy our work, you can support our work on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod, and saying something nice about us publicly is also a wonderful boost. Now, Richard has been brilliantly generous, and so there are goodies to be had. All Ko-Fi supporters will get an e-version of his best-selling book, provided you sign up before the end of Sunday the 5th. And if you join our Discord channel too, you have a chance of winning a signed copy of his brilliant The Children's Book of the Future, dedicated to the little human for whom it is intended. We shall meet again for Sunday school. Until then.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.